Okay, so I want to start going through the Mishnah and the Gemara straight now. We did a lot of Hakdama. We hopefully know a lot about the issues, a lot of the issues of Yibum and Chalitza. Now let's see how they're played out. More in a traditional daf. I wouldn't say one after the other, but at least we're going to go through Gimel Amid Beis and then Chesed Aleph and Chesed Beis, and then we'll circle back a little bit as the need arises. So you should have a Gemara in front of you.
Rabbi, just schedule wise, we're going straight. January, you go away for a week, but we're pretty straight till then.
I might be away, but I'll let you know if
okay. Okay.
At the moment, we're scheduled regularly. It's possible that I'll be away for a week, but
okay, great. Just wanted to know. Thank you.
Now we're straight. Okay, so the Mishnah, everybody who has access to a Gemara, I have it on the Marmakomos also, the Mishnah and the Gemara that we need, so you can follow in that way. But I know all the people presently on the Zoom certainly have access to a regular Gemara, so it's probably a little easier. So I'm going to start from the beginning again. We've done this Mishnah, but I want to start taking apart, each of the components of the Mishnah. So the Mishnah says, Chamesh Esrei Nashim. There are 15 women, meaning categories of women, who are potros tzoroseim, who are not only exempt from Yibum and Chalitza, I'll explain in a minute, but who also exempt the co-wives. Again, back in biblical times, it was possible for a man to be married to more than one wife. So if there is one of these 15 women, is one of the wives of the deceased, then all of his wives, let's say he has 2 wives to make it simple, but he could have 10 wives, doesn't make a difference, will be excluded from Yibum and Chalitza as well. Okay, so we'll analyze that. So there are 15 categories.
Rabbi Roth, we can hear you. Rabbi Roth? We can hear you.
I have a problem.
Okay, he can't hear us, evidently. Okay.
Who? No, I just wanted to know whether she's registered in the health program.
Oh, this is something else. Okay, so there are 15 wives who exempt their co-wives and co-wives of co-wives of co-wives. We'll explain that in a minute. Mina chalitza umina yibum, from chalitza and yibum, the 2 options to
is she registered? Is she registered?
And this is something that could go on for many different marriages, as we'll explain in just a moment. Elohein, and these are. So I'm just going to use. Rabbi Roth, can you hear us?
All right, here. She wants to tell you. You'll ask her yourself, and she wants to tell you.
Hello.
Oh, okay. I'm going to keep going anyway. So, so these are the 15 categories. These are the 15 women that we're talking about. The Elohim.
That's fine.
Bito, his daughter. Bas Bito, his granddaughter. Bas Beno, his granddaughter, the daughter of his son. Bas Ishto,
are you sure you paid?
Daughter of his wife, which might either be his biological daughter or might be his stepdaughter.
Okay.
Ubas Bina Ubas Bita.
Very good.
Wife's grandchild.
Okay, goodbye, Cher.
Either from her son or from her daughter. Then comes Chamoso, his mother-in-law. The Aim Chamoso, his mother-in-law's mother. Call it his grandmother-in-law.
Give me my phone.
Aim Chamiv, also a grandmother of law, but the mother of his father-in-law.
It's being charged. Let me have it.
Rachoso,
it's right there being charged.
Imo, his sister from his mother. Okay, everybody with me?
Yeah, Rabbi Roth, can you hear us? And Rabbi Roth? We can hear him very clearly. Rabbi, can you hear us? I tried to call both of his phones, but I was unsuccessful so far. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Maybe he'll call me back.
No.
Yeah. Want me to try again? I'll try. Rabbi Roth, can you hear? Maybe that's what he's trying.
I'll call him back. It looks like he's checking his phone now. Sorry about the interruption.
No, that's okay. Anyway, so it's Achos Imo, the his aunt from his mother's side, Achos Ishto,
Hello.
and his wife's sister, meaning another sister-in-law, the Eishes
I
Achiv
can't
min
another
Achah,
word.
and the wife of his brother, but his maternal brother, meaning his brother from his mother's side, who isn't his brother from his father's side. We're going to explain all this in just a minute. Now we're turning the page to Beis Omid Beis. The Eishes Achiv Shelo Hayab,
Well, I'll
and
try,
also
but I don't
the
have any
wife of his
experts
brother,
here.
who did not coexist with
All
him
right, thank
at
you.
the same time. What does that mean?
Okay, bye.
Brothers from the same father, but one was born after the other died. So the wife of the older brother, if she's if she's part of the Yibum situation, that's called an erva, and she is excluded from Yibum and Chalitza, and also exempts any co-wife as well. And the last one is Kalaso, his daughter-in-law. So just to make it clear, the Mishnah is going to explain what these are in just one more second. So I'm just going to hold off for that. Elu potros tsaroseim. Any of these women who are a candidate for Yibum also are not only exempted from Yibum and Chalitza, but they also exempt the co-wives who otherwise would be perfectly fine candidates. And this is true not only for co-wives, but for tsarosein, mina chalitza, mina yibum, ad sof ha'olam. What that means, as we'll see in a moment, is that let's say for a moment that let's just try to keep this in our minds. Let's say there are three brothers, Ruvain, Shimon, and Yehuda. No, Levi. Why should we skip Levi? Ruvain, Shimon, and let's better actually, there are four brothers. Say Ruvain, Shimon, Levi, and Yehuda. There are four brothers. So now the Gemara is going to explain, what this is. But before they do, I'm going to explain it very quickly. So let's say Ruvain is the oldest brother, and let's say he has a wife who is the daughter of Shimon. Let's say Ruvain married his niece. In the halacha, a person is allowed.
An uncle can marry his niece, but an aunt can't marry a nephew, right?
Correct.
Okay.
You can't marry your right. And a person cannot marry their aunt, but a person can marry his niece, which is exactly what you just said. I'm just looking at it from the husband's point of view because it just makes it simpler to understand. But you're right. So a person cannot marry his aunt, but a person can marry his niece. So let's say Ruvain, right, the older brother, married Shimon's daughter, his niece. Okay? But let's say Ruvain had another wife as well. Let's call her Sarah. Okay? So Ruvain was married to the niece of Shimon, to the daughter of Shimon, his niece, and also to Sarah. Right? So now, if Ruvain dies and he doesn't leave any children, so there are two possible candidates for Yibum or Chalitza. Right? One of them is the niece of Ruvain, who is the daughter of Shimon, and the other is Sarah, who's just a regular woman, has no particular connection or special relationship with Shimon. It's a little complicated, but you'll see it's not so complicated. So now Shimon, let's say, is the next brother in line. So he's supposed to do Yibum or Chalitza to the wife, one of the wives of Reuven, his deceased brother, right? But one of those women is his daughter. So since he can't do Yibum with his daughter, she's an erva. So now the question is, but can he do Yibum with Sarah, his daughter's co-wife, the other wife of his brother Reuven? So that's what a tzara is. A tzara is a rival. The word tzara really means a rival wife. I'm calling it a co-wife. Doesn't just to make it, I think, easier to picture. So what the Mishnah is mechadesh, it's really a machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. If you look at the Mishnah on Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, we've seen this already. Beis Shammai is of the opinion that while there's a ptur erva from Yibam and Chalitza, meaning if the candidate for Yibam and Chalitza is somebody who is an illicit marriage partner, meaning somebody who you cannot marry, who's an erva, so then, according to Beis Shammai, that person is excluded. But if there's a co-wife, right, Sarah, or Rivka, or Leah, whoever it is, then the co-wives can be subject to Yibum and Chalitza on behalf of Shimon. The only one that would be excluded is the one that he has a previous erva relationship with. So that's the view of Beis Shammai. That's very reasonable, but we don't paskin like Beis Shammai. We paskin like Beis Hillel. So Beis Hillel's chiddush is that when there is an erva in the mix, meaning in the candidate pool of Yibum and Chalitza, so all of the tsaros, all the rival co-wives are also excluded. That's the big chiddush of, that's called tsaras erva. So what the Mishnah says is that this is true, not only for the erva disqualifying the tsara, but once you have a tsaras erva can also disqualify another tsara. Now, what's the case? So that's why we were dealing with multiple brothers. Let's say Ruvain was married to Shimon's daughter and to Sarah, correct? Ruvain died. Now Shimon is prohibited from having any kind of yibum or any other relationship with his daughter, of course, right? And also with Sarah, because that's the din of Tzara, of not Sarah, but Tzara. Okay. Now, let's say, however, there's another brother, there's Levi. Now, Levi doesn't have any problem marrying the daughter of Shimon. It's a niece, just like it was a niece for Reuven, right? So there's no erva to prevent Levi from marrying either the daughter of Shimon, one of the co-wives of Reuven, or the tzara. Let's call her Sarah again, right? So let's say Levi goes ahead and marries Sarah, he does Yibum with Sarah, right? And let's say he had another wife as well. Let's call her Leah. So now Levi did Yibum with Sarah and was previously married to Leah. Let's say Levi now dies. So now Shimon, once again, is thrust into the candidacy of Yibum. But the options that he has, the two women who are candidates for his Yibum, one is Sarah, who was the tzara of his daughter, so she's excluded. But not only is she excluded, but her presence in the candidate pool, she's called tsaras erva, also will eliminate Leah. So let's say there keeps on being more brothers and everybody is sadly, dying without children. So every tzara, not only is a tzara prohibited from Yibum Chalitza, but a tsaras tzara, and a tsaras tsaras tzara, and a tsaras 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 tzara. And that's what the Mishnah means when it says ad sof kol ha'olam, meaning this could keep going. Anytime you have a tsaras erva of any sort, it eliminates the whole pool of candidates for that person. Okay. So that's what all of this means. That's what the words mean. Hare elu potros, the erva exempts tsarosehem, not only the erva itself, but the co-wives, the tsarosehem, and also the tzara of a tzara, meaning if there's another brother who does yibum and marries the tzara, and then he dies, so then there'll be a tsaras tzara, or if there's another brother after that, it could be a tsaras tzara, ad sof ha'olam. Then the Mishnah has another chiddush. This isn't such a bigger chiddush, but the kula nemesu o mianu o nisgarshu o shenimtzu ailanis tzarotseim mutaros. However, says the Mishnah, this impact that the presence of an erva in the candidate pool of Yibum, that it eliminates or disqualifies all of the rivals, all of the candidates. That is true only when the erva remains a viable wife, right, up to the moment that the mace that the person dies. Again, we'll say it one more time. So Reuven married Shimon's daughter, his brother Shimon's daughter. He married his niece, right? And also another woman named Sarah. So as long as the niece remains Reuven's wife at the moment that he dies, she's still his wife. We have this consequence. But let's say the niece died before Reuven died, and then Reuven dies, leaving Sarah. So that's not a problem. Shimon can marry Sarah, even though Sarah was once a rival or a co-wife of his daughter. But the fact is, at the moment of the Yibum, of the Zika, the daughter's already out of the picture because she died already. Or let's say the Reuven had a divorce. Reuven divorced his niece, the daughter of Shimon. I'm sure there was a lot of bad blood in the family, but either way, Reuven divorced the daughter of Shimon, who was previously his wife, and then let's say a year later, he died, without an heir. So that's not a problem. The fact that she used to be a wife of his does not exclude any of the tsaros, any of the other wives, from being subject to Yibum and Chalitza. The same is true, so that's Gerush and that's Misa. The same is true if let's say this niece, who's the erva, let's say she was a ketana, she was a minor, and therefore her marriage to Reuven was only a rabbinic marriage. It wasn't a biblical marriage. And not only that, but she can extricate herself from it. There's a process called miyun. Miyun literally means the right of refusal. So she, as a ketana, can get out of this marriage. She can be mima'enes. If she did, if she removed herself from the the status of being Reuven's wife before Reuven died, so then there'll be no impact on the tzara. Or if it turns out that this erva, let's say again, the niece, the daughter of Shimon, let's say it turns out that she was an islandess, meaning she was infertile. She didn't have the ability to give birth. So then, again, turns out that she was a wife, but she was never a candidate for Yibum. And therefore, the fact that she is an erva, that she is somebody who is excluded from having a relationship with the Yavam, who in this case is her father, would be irrelevant because she's not a real candidate anyway. So if there are co-wives, if Sarah, and the daughter of Shimon were both married to Reuven, and it turns out that the daughter of Reuven was an islandess, meaning she wasn't capable of bearing children, then Shimon would be able to marry Sarah. Okay, that's what the next words mean. V'kula nemesu o mianu o nizgarshu oceanim islandess. If the erva in the mix here that causes all the problems died or was divorced from the Reuven or practiced the right of refusal to negate that marriage or turned out to be not capable of childbearing, then tsoroseyan mutaros. Then the Mishnah goes on to say, V'iyata yachalomer b'chamoso u'be'em chamoso u'be'em chamiv shenimsu islandis o shemianu. If we're talking about in the cases of the Mishnah, we have cases of women who are older and who already have given birth. We're talking about a stepmother. I'm sorry, stepmother. We're talking about a mother-in-law, right, or a grandmother-in-law. So obviously they can be neither a islandess, can't be not have the ability to bear children because he's married, to their child. So obviously there's no islandess issue and there's no miyun issue, the right of refusal, because that's only when they're dealing with a minor wife, meaning a wife who's under the age of, legal stature, let's say under 12. So obviously those cases don't apply. That's what the Mishnah says. Either way, then the Mishnah explains, Ketzad potros tsaroseim. What do we mean when we say that an erva, like a daughter, right, is exempts the other co-wives? So the Mishnah explains exactly what we just talked about. Hoisa bito, right? If the daughter of the potential yavam, brother-in-law, is married to his brother, o achas mikala arayos ha'elu, or one of these other 15, is nesuos la'achiv below isha cheres, and the deceased brother had another wife as well, umace, and then he dies, this brother, meaning Ruvain, dies, kishem shabito patura, just as Shimon cannot do yibam and chalitza with his daughter, and therefore she is exempt from yibam and chalitza, kach tsarasa patura, so too her, meaning the daughter of Shimon's co-wife, rival, right, they were both wives of Ruvain, is also excluded. What is tsaras tsara ad sofa olam? So the Mishnah explains, holcha tsaras bito, if the what we called tsara, if the second wife, the non-compromised wife of Ruvain, ends up being subject of yibum, not by Shimon, but by Shimon's other brother Levi, Benisis la'achiv hasheni, she married she became a Yavama to the second brother, meaning Ruvain died. He left Shimon and Levi as brothers. Shimon can't be miyabim for the reasons we discussed, but Levi can marry the tzara. So the din is, below isha cheres, let's say Levi has an additional wife, let's say Leah. So he's married to Sarah, the tzara of Shimon's daughter, and he's also married to Leah, umace, and then Levi dies, right? So now Shimon once again is a candidate for Yibum, and in that group of potential Yavamas is the tsaras erva of his daughter, kishem shetzaras bito petura, kach tsaras tsarasa petura. So this contamination, if you will, or this disqualification based on the presence of erva and therefore the presence of tsaras erva or the presence of tsaras erva, etc., is something that continues. Afilohain mea, even if it's 100 removed from the original. Okay. Then the Mishnah says, Ketzad imesu tsaraseim mutaros. What do we mean when we say that if the erva dies, that the tsaros are permissible? Let's say that Shimon's daughter, or some other erva, who is married to Ruvain, his brother, right? Velo isha cheres, and Ruvain had a second wife as well. So Mesa Bito, if the daughter of Shimon, meaning his niece, Ruvain's niece, if she dies before he does, O Nisgarsha, or he divorces her, Bi'achakach Mes, and dies only later, Bi'achach Mes Achiv, sorry, Tsarasa Muteres. The Tsara is not compromised or disqualified, because at the moment of the beginning of the Yibum process, which is the death of the brother, all right, that erva was already out of the picture. And then finally, the Mishnah concludes, Kola yichola lemain v'lo miana tsarasa koletzas v'lo misavemes. This idea of a marriage to a minor, to somebody underage, where there's an option of what we call to be mima'enes, the right of refusal to get out, to extricate herself from the marriage. If she doesn't exercise it, nonetheless, there would be chalitza, because minat Torah, there is no marriage to a ketana, a mima'enes anyway, only if the father agrees. Mima'enes is usually a situation where there is no father. So, or a situation where there was a previous divorce, so the father has no sway. That's how it can case in the Mishnah. So what the Mishnah is saying is that if there's a miyun, even if it wasn't exercised, that would only be a yibum derabanan, or that would be an ishus derabanan, sorry, and therefore there would be chalitza no yibum. That's the Mishnah. So the takeaway from the Mishnah is threefold. Number one, that if there is, even though Yibum allows a brother-in-law to marry his sister-in-law, which typically is prohibited, that's true only for his wife, for the wife of his brother who died. It's not true if there's an additional erva as well, like his daughter, his stepmother, I'm sorry, his mother-in-law, his grandmother-in-law, his other sister-in-law, let's say, meaning Achos Ishto, the wife of his, I'm sorry, the sister of his wife. If there's another erva involved, they are excluded from Ibum. A. B. Not only are they excluded from Ibum, they also disqualify the co-wives. And three, that's all true as long as the wife, the erva, was part of the story at the time of the Misas Hames. But if it was already a divorce or a predeceasing of the erva, there wouldn't be a problem. Those are the takeaways of the mission. Okay, everybody with me so far?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. I hope it's a real yes. Good. So now let's turn our attention to the Gemara. So the first issue that the Gemara discusses pertains to the order of the women who are considered an erva in the Mishnah. As you can see, the Gemara, it's Gemara's attention to detail, even to, the order of a list is legion, right? I mean, the Gemara is always interested in these, details. The assumption is that the Mishnah was written in a rigorous, with a rigorous, perspective in mind. And therefore, if people are listed, that there's a rhyme or a reason to the order. So here the Gemara asks the following: Nechti, Kulu me'achos isha yalfina. This is the Gemara on Beis Amud Beis. That's what we're up to. If anybody's following in the sheets, it's still on page 1, but it's towards the first half, Nechti, where it says Gemara. Okay, so most people have a Gemara. Nechti, says the Gemara. The Gemara asks a question. As we will learn in another daf on Gimel Amud Beis, this special chiddush that an erva also disqualifies the tsaros, the co-wives, that din is derived from achos isha. In the parsha in Achrei Mos, there's an extra word litzror, as we'll learn. That's from the language of tsara. So the wife's sister is the case where the language of the Torah teaches us the din of ptur tsara. So the Gemara says, since that is the source, right? Lisni achos isha bereisha. So why don't we mention the sister's, the wife's sister, which is the paradigm case? Why don't we mention that first among the arayos of the Mishnah? Instead, we have bito, baspina, right? We have, daughter and granddaughters before we have the sister of your wife. But the limud, the source for the ptur tzara comes from the sister of your wife. So that's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara says, "V'chi tema," lest you say, "Tana chumri nakat." Maybe the order of the Mishnah goes in order of which arayos constitutes a bigger avera, because there's levels of severity. These are all death penalties, but some of them are misa bidei shamayim, some of them are misa bidei adam, some of them are, sreifa and skila. So the Gemara says, if the order was an order of harshness, in other words, the severity of the violation, as reflected by the punishment, says the Gemara, if that were the case, Rab Shimon and it was in accordance with the view Rab Shimon, who says that sreifa is chamura, that death by fire is the worst. Yihachi, lishni chamoso bereisha. Then why not mention the mother-in-law first, because that's the most severe of the onshim. The ikar sreifa b'chamoso ksiva. The main punishment of death by fire, when it comes to erva, is mentioned by chamoso, by the mother-in-law. Ba'od, moreover, basar chamoso lisni kaloso. Right after speaking about the mother-in-law, which is Bisrefa, they should have mentioned the daughter-in-law, right? The Basar Srefa, Skila Kamura, because the punishment for being physically involved with a daughter-in-law is also a very severe one. It's not Srefa, but it is Skila, which is more severe than some of the other ervas. So if we were going in order of degree of severity of the Isser, then we should have had Kamaso and then Kalaso. But Kalaso actually is the last. And either way, the first is Bito. So the Gemara says, initially, Ela Bito, the reason that we start with Bito, with his daughter, is Kivin the Asim Midrasha Chavivale. This is a very interesting, not so much about Ibum, but an interesting line in the Gemara. The Gemara says, actually, the daughter referred to is not a daughter within his marriage, not his daughter from his wife, or not his daughter from a wife. It's a daughter from an illegal, liaison outside of the marriage. That's what Rashi explains on Gimel and Aleph. And if you look at the Tosas here on the bottom of the page, Tosas says, Bito kivin da ase midrasha chavivale, hainu bito me anu saso. Meaning this is outside of the marriage. So the din that there's an erva of bito, even if she's not formally within the framework of a marriage, that's derived from a drasha. But the Gemara says something quite amazing, and that is, things that are derived from a drasha are more chaviv, are more endearing. So this is one of those Gemaras in Shas which seem to contradict other Gemaras, but they don't really contradict it. We'll say that they present a dialectic on the question of, what is of greater value, Torah Shebechsav or Torah Shebal Peh, the written Torah or the oral Torah. On the one hand, clearly the written Torah has a unique status that, defies any kind of analogy, right? In the sense that it is literally Dvar, we believe it to be literally Dvar Hashem, the words of God, like every letter, and maybe even spelling, is significant. That's why if you have a Sefer Torah and it's missing a letter, it's disqualified, it's puzzle, because we darshan from the letters, and because even the spelling we consider to be, of divine significance. So that's why we have a law that, Dvarim Shebechsav, Iya Torah Shoyla Omer Al Peh. You have to read it from the text. It's a text. And the text and the spelling and the form and the exact words are very significant. So obviously, we speak about, the Ramban in his commentary, on the Torah, in his introduction, says that all of the words of the Torah are names of God, right? To call a Torah kula shemosav shalai kadosh baruch. It's a kind of a semi-mystical or maybe a mostly mystical idea. But if you switched around the letters in different ways, they'd all be Shmos Hashem, whatever that means. But the bigger point is that, anything in Torah Shebechsav has a divine, imprimatur. And there are those who think that, even halachically, things that are derived directly from a psukim in the Torah have a higher stature than things that, are derived only from a drasha. I mean, for example, the Rambam seems to say that if a person took an oath, let's say not to eat chatzi shir of chelav, the Gemara says at the beginning of the 9th parak of Yoma, the last chapter of Masechet Yoma regarding Yom Kippur, the Gemara discusses, we've discussed this here in the past, the Gemara discusses the principle of chatzi shir asr b'nat Torah. But a half a shear or less than a full shear is prohibited in the Torah. Meaning, let's say you're not allowed to eat, a kazayas of matzah, right, on Pesach, of chametz, sorry, on Pesach. And let's say you eat half a kazayas, or 3/4 of a kazayas, or 1/4 of a kazayas. So the Gemara says that that's called chatzi shir asur min Torah. It's derived from the pasuk kol chelev. It says, it doesn't say chelev, it says kol chelev, like any piece of chelev, right? So that's asur min Torah. It's a biblical prohibition. However, the Rambam says if a person took an oath and he said, I commit hereby that I'm not going to eat half a shear or less than the full shear of chametz, the oath would be binding. So the question is, why would it be binding? We have a rule that says, Mujba v'yomed mihar Sinai, that whenever you have an oath that is superfluous, because the Torah itself already prohibits something, so that is a superfluous oath or a gratuitous oath, and it shouldn't be binding. So if the Torah says kol chelev, and the drasha, what we derive from it is that not only can you not eat a kazayas, you can't even eat less than the shear, less than the full amount. You don't get the full punishment, but you do get, it is a violation. So how can it be that if you take an oath, that the oath wouldn't be superfluous? This is a din daraisa, the din of chatzi shir asur min Torah. So the Mefarshim of the Rambam explained in Hilchos Shavuos that the Rambam believes there's a hierarchy. He believes that things that are derived directly in the Torah have a higher status, and the din of mujba v'yomed mihar Sinai, the idea that an oath is considered to be redundant if it's already in the Torah, that means explicit in the Torah. It doesn't mean things derived from a drasha. Now, those who think things derived from a drasha, maybe you wouldn't say sveka, doraisa, l'chumra, that when you have a doubt that you're stringent, you go stringently. The Rambam holds it. That's only din drabanan. Most people think it's a din doraisa, it's a biblical law. There are those who suggest that there's a difference between things derived from a drasha. I mean, the Rambam famously, when he talks about kiddushay kesef and other things, has this phrase that he uses for things that are derived from drashos called divrei sofrim. And there's a whole discussion whether divrei sofrim is a rabbinic or a biblical. I think the answer is neither, but that's not for now. But the point is that the Rambam, in numerous places, seems to project that something that is explicit in the Torah's writing, has a higher legal status, either as a mitzvah or as a prohibition. So on the one hand, there's no denying the prominence, and the prestige of that which is explicit in the Torah. At the same time, the Gemara says in Masechet Gittin, and Daf Samech Amud Aleph, that most of the Torah is oral tradition, and that in some respects, oral tradition is more beloved than the written tradition. Number one, it's concepts, not just words. That's why Dvarim Shabal Peh Ya Torah Shoy Lekosom. You're not really supposed to write them down. We do write them down because Eis Lasos Hashem Efer Torah Secha. There was a crisis at one point where they didn't want to trust the details of Torah Shabal Peh, of the oral law, to memory. So they decided that they could write it down as an emergency. That's what we do today. But at least preferably, ideally, it's the concept. So the actual form, the actual language is less important. But all Mishnah, all Gemara, all Medrash, all of that is Torah Shabal Peh. Number one, it's beloved because it's massive and it requires a great level of commitment, not to memorize it, but to internalize it. But I think it's more than that. And the bigger idea, in addition to being concepts, and in addition to requiring, extraordinary vigilance and commitment, to internalize it and to be attuned to it, etc., is that this is the source of the dynamism of halacha as a system. And that's the fact that it is also includes the input of Chachmei HaMasorah, of those who are steeped in the study and immersed in it and become attuned to it. They become part of the system as its interpreters. That's what Chachmei HaMasorah is all about. And that concept basically amounts to a unique relationship between the Jewish people through its scholars, and Kadosh Baruch Hu and God. We're not only the passive recipients of the Torah, but we are as insiders who accept it, who said Na'aseh v'nishma. We are also its authentic junior interpreters as well. So in that sense, and the dynamism of the set of halakha, the ability of the halakha to respond, even in modern times, and even with all the changes that have taken place throughout history, to still be applying the fixed, eternal laws, even to, challenging, changing, influx, circumstances, that capacity is a very extraordinary thing. And that capacity is rooted or anchored in the status of Torah as oral law, as Torah Shabbal Peh. So I think when the Gemara here says, Elabito kivin da'asi midrasha chavivale, the last words on Beis Amud Beis, what the Gemara means to say is that while there is extra stature to things that are explicit in the Torah, and there certainly is, as we discussed just a couple of minutes ago, at the same time, there's a special affection or endearment for things that are derived from a drasha, because that represents, the extra commitment, the dynamism, the junior partnership that Klal Yisrael has when it comes to interpreting and applying the Torah itself. So that's the Gemara's initial answer, that the list of arayos in the Mishnah on Daf Beis Amud Aleph is not based on the severity of the violation, but it is based on, the first thing that is there is something that is derived from a drasha, namely bitom outside of marriage. Okay. So then the Gemara asks, now I'm on the top of Gimel Amud Aleph, the Gemara says, Kulunami midrasha asu. What do you mean? It's not only bito, the erva of the daughter, which is excluded from Yibum. That's not the only thing that's derived from a drasha that isn't explicit in the pasuk. After all of the erva's exclusion from Yibum is derived from the words, the extra word that appears in the context of achos ishto, his wife's sister, and from there we made a drasha to apply it to Yibum, all the ervas. So why do you mean only bito? So the Gemara says, no. Nehi dil'inyan yibum asyan midrasha ikari suraya behedja ksivbahu. The Gemara says the list of arayos, of illicit relationships in Parshas Achrei Mos, that's explicit in the Psukim. The only thing that's a drasha there is the extension to a daughter outside of marriage. But while it's true that the exclusion of all ervas in Yibum and Chalitza and the capacity to create an exclusion for Tsaras erva, all of them are learned from a drasha, but the categories themselves are not learned from a drasha, with the exception of Bito, they're all explicit in the pasuk. Okay, so that's what the Gemara till now is saying. The Amar Rava, as Rava says, Amar li Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avdimi, Asya, Heina, Asya, Zima. If you want to look at Rashi, you can get the details. This is the source for saying that a daughter, even if she is not, from within the framework of a marriage, is still considered to be an illicit relationship that is excluded from any kind of marriage or yibum, etc. Okay, so then the Gemara says, "Hashta de Amris kol milsa de Asya midrasha bavivale." If we're going with this idea that the order of the Mishnah and the decision to begin with the daughter is based on the fact that it's derived from a drasha. So lisni lachos isha libesof. So if the hierarchy is a drasha, then why not put achos isha, which is the source of all this? That's the most explicit source in Torah Shabbat. That should be the last on the list instead of kalaso, instead of a daughter-in-law. Says the Gemara, Aidi da'iri bi'isar achvasa tananami achos ishto. The Gemara says, listen, we started the list with Bito for good reason, with the daughter, and then we did some other things, which we'll get to in a moment. And then we started talking about sisters, sister of your mother, sister, um, of your sister from your mother's side, your sister from your mother's side. So once they're talking about sisters, they also included achos ishto, meaning the sister of his wife. Okay. So then the Gemara says, Vilitanya lahai bava libesov. Why don't they just take all the sisters and put them at the end of the Mishnah? Elatana kurve nakat. So the Gemara says, no, there's another consideration. Not the chavivos of the drasha, but how intense is this korba? How intense are these people? How intensely are these people related to each other? What does that mean? So the Gemara says, Nokat Tana Bito. The first one that's mentioned is the closest relative, and that is a daughter. Of all the women mentioned in the Mishnah, the one that is the closest relative is a daughter. And then comes Baspito Baspino, granddaughters from a son or from a daughter. Dekrove Atzmo, because those are inherent or intrinsic krovin, as opposed to like a mother-in-law or a grandmother-in-law or a daughter-in-law or various, sisters-in-law, which are all relatives through marriage, but there's no blood relationship there. So the Gemara explains, V'aida detana gimel doris lamata. We started off with the daughter, and the daughter included, granddaughter, from the daughter or from the son. So it's a shlosha doris lamata, daughter and two granddaughters, dide of him. Tanami shlosha doros lamata dida. So then the next group in the Mishnah, if you go back to the Mishnah, is his wife's daughter and his wife's granddaughter from a daughter and granddaughter from a son, meaning his stepdaughter and his step grandchildren, his wife's, in other words, daughter and granddaughters. So we went from his daughter and granddaughters to his wife's daughter and granddaughters. But I did the tanush shlosha doris lamata dida, tananami shlosha doris lamala dida. Then once we're dealing with, that kind of hierarchy, so then we turned our attention to the three generations above the wife. That means her mother, her grandmother, both from her mother's side and her father's side. That's his mother-in-law and his grandmother's in-law. And then after that, Tana Achoso, the Achos Imo, then you have his sister from his mother's side and his mother's sister, the Kroveatzmo. Those two are also inherent Krovim because they're blood relatives. And in that context of blood relatives who are sister of the mother, sister of himself, Tana Achos Ishto. Once we're talking about sisters, they also included Achos Ishto, meaning his sister-in-law, not the wife of his brother, but the sister of his wife. Now comes a very important line that's going to occupy us for a few minutes, because I think it opens an interesting window into, we can call it the anthropology of the Jewish family, of the halachic Jewish family. So the Gemara says, "Ubedinhu." The last two in the Mishnah are the wife of his brother, but a brother who he never knew, meaning who died before he was born, his wife, meaning his sister-in-law, who was married to the brother that he never knew, right? That's the second to last item in the Mishnah of Erva. And the last item is Kaloso, his daughter-in-law, meaning the woman who is married to his son. So the Gemara asks, shouldn't they had daughter-in-law before Esha Sachiv Shelo Yabolamo? Before his sister-in-law, meaning the wife of the brother that he never knew? Because that, delo mishum kurvahu dasira. That's not a kurva prohibition.
Also, are all of these permanent, or are any of these temporary?
Say that again?
Are all of these permanently usher, or can their status ever change?
Oh, so that's a great question. That is a great question. The only one whose status might change, aside from Yibum, which of course is our major topic, is Achos Ishto, the sister of his wife.
So daughter-in-law is permanent.
Daughter-in-law is permanent. Mother-in-law, grandmother-in-law, stepmother, all those things are permanent. The only one that's not permanent is the sister of his wife. If his wife dies, then he can marry his sister. And I think that's very important for our understanding here, which I'll get to that in just a second. By the way, I believe that was the situation with the late Ariel Sharon.
Interesting.
Ariel Sharon married two sisters, meaning he was married
Not at the same
to a
time.
woman.
Right.
She died, and then he married her sister.
He loved his in-laws.
And I use a very complicated man, so I wouldn't want to, go too deeply in it. But, he was a larger than life figure that you could say.
Yeah. We had a memorial at the shul for him. Yeah.
What?
We did it. Rabbi Kurmeyer did a memorial at the shul for him.
For Ariel Sharon. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, as again, he had this terrible stroke, and then he was anyway, he was a very interesting character. His wife, when he died, his wife was really his second wife, was his wife's sister, who he married after she died, which is halachically permissible. But almost every other erva is permanent. Which makes for a very interesting issue, because we'll see that including in the Ramban in a couple of minutes, hopefully, if we have time, and that is that we'll see that the status of Achos Isha, meaning the sister of his wife, is very prominent in these topics. Right? We started off that way. Mechti kula me Achos Isha Yalfina. Right? So it's just interesting because the Gemara, as we go forward, you'll see, suggests maybe she's the only one who's excluded from Yibum of the Erevas. Meaning the Gemara seems to have two opposite views. You could call it, again, dialectical, when it comes to the special status of Achos Ishto, his wife's sister. On the one hand, we know there's a tremendous kula, which is what you were just asking about, or my response to your question, and that she's the only erva, pretty much, which, who becomes permissible after the sister dies. Right? If the son, Nebuch, dies, he can't marry his daughter-in-law. And if his father dies, he can't marry his stepmother. Right? But he could marry his wife's sister after she dies. That seems to be like an important kula on the one hand. On the other hand, the Gemara seems to be suggesting in a few places that maybe this is a particularly severe erva, and you would have thought that maybe there would be yibum for other erayos, just because, or other erayos wouldn't have the ability at least to disqualify a tzara. Maybe only Achos, maybe Achos Isha, which is where the drasha appears from. maybe that's unique. Maybe it's dafka achos isha. So when you think about it, what? How could it be only achos isha? Is achos isha more kal or more chamor? You're suggesting that it's more chamor and only achos isha poisons the tzara, or only achos isha is excluded from ibum, but let's say other arayos, which have no heter under any condition, they would be permissible in ibum? So which is it? Is achos isha more kal or more chamor? Right? So you have mixed evidence. So in my opinion, and I'll try to support this with Ramban. If we don't get to it today, we'll get to it next time. Hopefully we'll get to it today. I think the answer is that it's very complicated, but I think it's an understandable complication. Meaning, on the one hand, the sister of your wife is a particularly illicit relationship, because it obviously it calls into question the whole tznius and the whole a relationship with your wife, which is a very existential bond. So your connection to your wife is such that as long as she's alive, and even if there's a divorce, frankly, doesn't make a difference. Even then, achos isha is prohibited. But it's not a natural erva. It's not a blood erva. It's an erva, which is exacerbated in terms of its severity by the loyalty and the sanctity that you owe your wife. So on the one hand, that's very chamor. Ad kedei kach, that you might have thought that maybe other ervas could be subject to yibum, because anyways we're setting aside an erva for the sake of yibum. We're setting aside the prohibition of eshes ach, of the wife of a brother. So why not set aside? You're pushing, because of yibum's urgency. We're pushing away one erva. Why not push away two ervas? But maybe not when it comes to achos isha, because what? You're going to be loyal and you're going to solve your brother's legacy problem at the expense of your wife. That's also a critical bond. Means kiyesh v'achim yachta, but it's bal keishto and ishto kebal. So I wonder, whether or not maybe that isn't the reason. You're gonna create one sister-in-law a solution, at the expense of being mater another sister-in-law, which is a violation of your marriage. So, or a bigger violation of your marriage, we'll call it, or more sensitive or acute violation. So that's one side of it. But the other side of it is that once the wife, is no longer, living, so that's a different story. And it's not a violation of her dignity and so on. So I think it's an interesting kind. We'll see in a moment that actually, let me just talk about it now for a second. The Ramban has an interesting note. The Ramban says, listen, in the end of the day, the Gemara talks about, we're going to get to this in just, we just read the line, but let's get to the Perushim in just a minute. The Gemara is saying, why is the sister-in-law last on the list? It should be before why is the daughter-in-law last on the list? It should be before the sister-in-law who is married to the brother, that died before you were born. That's the Gemara's question. So the Ramban says, okay, if we're going back to that, why not bring up, why is achos ishto, why is his wife's sister included with his own sister and his own aunt, who are blood relatives? That doesn't seem right. It's still only still a relationship through marriage. It's his wife's sister. So the Ramban says something quite remarkable. If you look here on page, 1 second, I think it's page 4 of the new Marmot Talmud. So I'm just going to read you the line. Yeah, or page 5? No, page 4. Yeah. Chidush Ramban, Masachet Yevamos, Gimel Amud Aleph. So, Hachi Garsina, V'chein Benuschei Atiki, Ramban notes on different girsos. But in the old Gersosa, bedinu de lekadme lekaloso mekame eshes achiv shelo yabalamo delav mishum kurvahu dasira ba'idi da'ira be'isar achba v'chule hake perusho me'ikara tanachoso. First, we learned we counted sister, the achosimo, and his maternal aunt, the kroveatzmo, because those are intrinsic relatives. I mean, they're blood relatives. They share DNA, right? The Aidi Da'iri Be'isar Achva, but once we're dealing with sisters already, Tana Acho Sisho. So we also mention his wife's sister, but that doesn't seem right because that's not a blood relationship at all. So the Ramban says Klomar. Remember, whenever anybody ever says Klomar, they're trying to explain something. They're uncomfortable. They're saying, when I say, in other words, when I say the words in other words, it's because I'm not completely satisfied, that I've been clear. So it's like a little overcompensation, or like, don't ask me this question because this is the answer. So Klomar, Akadma Makame Esha Sachiv Me'imo, like, why are we putting his wife's sister on a list which is about intrinsic kurva or intense kurva? Why are we putting her before Eshes Achiv Me'imo? Why is that any better than his brother, his maternal brother's wife? They're both sisters-in-law, right? What's the difference between his brother's wife and his wife's sister? They're both sisters-in-law. So they should be together. There shouldn't be a kedima for his wife's sister together with real relatives. That's what the Ramban is asking. But the Ramban's answer is quite amazing. He says, Mishum de bekidushe atzmo mekarvele. Right? V'dami tzvei, I'll explain in a second. Likrove atzmo. So this is a fascinating comment. Ramban says like this: when he marries his wife, then he chooses, I don't know whether that's his motivation, but certainly his action is what makes him related to her sister. Right? That's not true about the other sisters-in-law, meaning the sister-in-laws that are the wives of his brother, right, have nothing to do with any choice that he made. So is this a technical point, or it sounds like Ramban's saying something very profound, and that is that there are two levels of sister-in-law, and that the sister-in-law, your wife's sister, is actually a closer relationship, even akin to intrinsic kurva, because it's part of a decision that you make to merge, by merging with your wife, you're merging, with her family. And as such, that's different than the relationship that you have with your brother's wife. They're both sisters-in-law, but in a different way, because that's a decision that he made. That's not a decision that you made. And it's not a decision that goes through your wife. It's a decision that goes through your brother's decision to marry his wife. So one would have thought that all sisters-in-law are the same. And we're being told that it isn't true. It says the Ramban. Okay, but before we get back to that, let me go back to Rashi, because I think there's something profound here as well. So what does the Gemara mean when it says that in the end of the day, it sounds like it's saying that Eshes Achiv Shelo Yabolamo, his sister-in-law, married to the brother that he never could have known, that's not kurva. But his daughter-in-law is kurva. What does that mean? So the way Rashi explains it, if you look at Rashi on Gimel Amud Aleph, Rashi says it's not only his sister-in-law, the wife of the brother that he never knew. It would also be true of his sister-in-law, the wife of his maternal brother, meaning his brother from his mother's side, his wife as well. And the big issue, says Rashi, is that when the Gemara says it's not midin kurva, what they mean is these are all artificial relationships through marriage. They're all basically equal. However, since kalaso is more chomor in the onesh, going back to the previous Gemara, that's what the Gemara meant. So if you look at Rashi here, Rashi says here, the lav mishum kurva hu da asur, klomar, the kiva de krovin nakat, the azil, since we already dealt with real relatives, blood relatives, the kalaso ve'eshes achiv shaloya balamo, and then he adds, ve'eshes achiv me'imo, right? His daughter-in-law and his two sisters-in-law that are not subject to yibum. One, the wife of a brother he never knew. The other, the wife of a brother from his mother. Lav mishum kurva didehu. They're not blood relatives. They're only marital relatives. The asir and lay. Therefore, bedinu de lisni kalaso mekam eshes achiv shalo yabalamo mekam eshes achiv me'imo mishum de kalaso chamira tzvei minayu. So a way that it's a problem reading the Gemara. Rashi A added Eshes Achiv Me'imo to the mix. And Rashi says what it means is very simple. These are not blood relatives, they are marriage relatives. Rashi's assuming that all marriage relatives have the same status. It's a generic quality. It doesn't matter who they're married to. It just matters that they're not your direct relative, they are artificial relatives. They're all on the same level. So why should Kala on the list be before Eshes Achiv Shaloya Balamo? The answer is because what we said in the previous daf, and that is when you can't decide it through Korva, intensity of Korva, then you decide it through the Chomer of the Onesh. But what emerges from Rashi is that he thinks that all marital ervas have the same equal level of kurva. They're all artificial, and all artificial are generically the same. Tosas disagrees. If you look at Tosas, it's very interesting. Mekame eshes achiv shalei balamo. This, I guess, will complete for today. V'hu adin mekame eshes achiv me'imo. Like Rashi, he adds something that isn't in the Gemara, and that is, Eshes Achiv Me'imo. The Travayu Lav Krove Atzmo Ninu. Like Rashi, he's explaining the line of the Gemara, Lav Krovim Ninu, meaning they're not blood relatives, they're marital relatives. Elaide Kiddushin. So why should Kala be earlier? Unlike Rashi, who says that's because of the Chomer HaOnesh, the Balei Tosas say no, not all marital ervas or korvas are the same. Maybe it depends on who they're marrying and whether or not there's a more intense relationship with that person or not. So that's what Tosa says. Halaso shehi eshes beno krova minayu tvei. The daughter-in-law is closer to him than the sister-in-law because he's closer objectively to his son than he is to his brother. Now, Rashi knew that, but Rashi was saying it doesn't matter. They're all just marital relatives. They're all the same. And Tosa is saying, no, they might be marital relatives, but how close they are depends on the intensity of the blood relative that they're connected to, which makes the extended kurva. In a way, that's what the Ramban was saying also. The Ramban was saying, but the Ramban wasn't saying that it depends on the intensity of the blood relative relation. The Ramban is a different factor. And that is, if you choose to marry your wife, then that creates a closer relationship to the relatives through marriage as well. And Rashi's saying all relatives to marriage have the same status, and Tosas is saying no, it depends on the link. So a son is a more intense connection than a brother. אבל אין לומר דווקא לגבי איש הסוכן שלו יבולמו kaloso breva tve. You could have said something else, and that is that maybe all we're saying is that the daughter-in-law is closer than the sister-in-law shelo hayabalamo, lefi shelo yabalamo. So since it was never, meaning it's not a regular, it's a brother that he never knew, never could have known, because they never coexisted. So maybe that's a weaker relationship. But if we're talking about his maternal, brother's sister, but his sort of brother's wife, I mean, his sister-in-law from his maternal brother, that wouldn't be true. So what would be the consideration? I'm just going to finish with this tosis, and then we'll stop. The be'eshes beno iflag dara. You might have said the following consideration. It's very interesting. That's why I say it's a little bit of halachic anthropology here. Like, how do you define kurva? Right? So Tosa says the following. If you look at the Gemara in Bava Basra and Guf Chav Ches Samad Aleph, Dafilaman Demakshir Ba'aba Da'aba Pasul Ben Achiv. So that might have been a consideration. What is that? The Gemara there speaks about not erva and not Yerusha, but psule kurva. Like in order to be a witness, you have to be a rachok. You can't be related. What is the definition of being related as in terms of psul edus, disqualifying for testimony? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin discusses there's where you draw the line. There's something called echad b'yachad, echad b'sheni, sheni b'shlishi. It's a structural thing. So like a man and his son is echad b'yachad. A man and his grandson, is I'm sorry, echad b'yachad. So, So the Gemara in Bava Basra has the possibility that a grandfather and a grandson wouldn't be krovim for purposes of eidos, even though a man and his nephew, his brother's son, would be disqualified. Now, structurally, they're the same, just that one is skips a generation vertically, one is 2 generations away vertically, right? You can call it echad, bishlishi, and the other one is the same amount of steps away, but it's only 1 generation, not 2 generations. That's what Tosas means. They say it's palig dara. The Gemara, it's not. We don't paskin this way. In fact, we paskin according to the Rashbam. We paskin the opposite way. I'll explain in just a second. But maybe meaning what Tosas is saying is maybe when it comes to intensity of relationships, the generation gap is a factor, not only the distance from each other. So again, one more time, a father, a grandfather, and a grandson are the same amount of steps away from each other as an uncle and a nephew. However, the Gemara thought that an uncle and a nephew are more puzzle, are more krovim than a grandfather and a grandson, because of ispalig dara, because there's also a generation gap. So the Gemara thought, so that's what Tosas is suggesting, you might have thought like this, that a kala, a daughter-in-law, is more distant than a sister-in-law, because there's a generation gap. The sister-in-law is a contemporary. It doesn't always work out that way, of course, but I mean, structurally, it's your brother's wife, or in the other case, your wife's sister. Right? Those are contemporaries. But your son's wife is 1 generation lower. So Tosa says you might have thought that if we're talking about achiv shelo yabolamo, somebody who didn't coexist with you and therefore you never really had a relationship with them, so then kala is better than that. But kala compared to a maternal brother's wife maybe is less, because there's a generation gap. I should mention that the Gemara in Bava Basra and Kuf Kaf Ches, the way the Rashbam learns the conclusion is the opposite. The Rashbam says lahalacha that there is a psul, but not only a psul when the grandfather to a grandson, But even a great grandfather and a great grandson, as long as it's all in one vertical line, is always possible. Meaning, not only is there no generation gap, but since it's all direct, it's father, son, you don't even count that at all. Not only do we give more credence to the generation gap, but you give less credence to it. The balitosis and balabasra, and this is the mainstream view, is no. If it's a grandson and a grandfather, so that's like, echad b'sheni or echad b'shlishi, depending how you count it. But if it was great, that would be kosher. Anyways, but getting back to the Kala, so the Gemara Tosa is saying, don't think that a generation gap is a factor like it might have been in Psule Edus in Erva. Why not? So he explains that when it comes to matter of illicit relationships, Eishes beno krova tvei me'eshasach. Shahaben kara davua, dekachosha bito bas bito krova yatzmo tvei me'achoso. A daughter and a granddaughter is a closer relationship than a sister because of the principle ben karadavua, in this case, bas karadavua too, meaning these are your direct, closest relatives. One could have said a little bit differently with this. I'm going to close. I mentioned this when we talked about Yehuda and Tamar in the Psukim in Vayeshev. Maybe this is a different point, or maybe it's the same point because of this. But in Parshas Achrei Mos, when the Torah speaks about Kalaso, his daughter-in-law, it instead of saying just Eshes Beno, it says Kalaso he, implying that, of course, a daughter-in-law is the wife of your son, but because of that, she also becomes your daughter. And I think I mentioned several times, I'm very taken by the comment of Rav Hirsch in Parshas Noach and Lech Lecha and in other places, where he just notes that, the truism that a chassan and kala are called, the bride and the groom are called after the roles that they will play in the other person's family, a son-in-law and a daughter-in-law. So the idea that a daughter-in-law, and that's why in Parsha of Erva, kalasohi, maybe, and that's kind of what Tosas is saying, but it isn't just the kurva of the ben, it's also maybe that there's a more direct correlation as well. So this might affect other things in terms of the Erva of Ben Noach. We talked about Ramban and Daf Tzarichas. But to sum up, it's an interesting window into the hierarchy of relationships. Here it's Erva. I mean, you also have to look at Yerusha, inheritance law, and you have to look at Psule Edus, the disqualification of testimony. Like, what are the various family relationships and the hierarchies? Baal Ishto, Ishto Kebal. When is a nephew a nephew, and an uncle, as opposed to the son of your brother, the brother of your father. When are relationships direct and when are they indirect for all these purposes? Daughter-in-law is a great example of this, but also sister-in-law, and maybe the two types of sister-in-law, achos isha versus eshes ach. So there's one other comment I just wanted to make, and that is the Ritva. I'm not going to read it inside, but I'll end with it. The Ritva here has a different take. He just says that when it comes to Yibum, the Gemara means that only to exclude, not, he disagrees with Rashi and Tosas. He, even though they insert implicitly, also Achos, Eshes, Achiv, Me'imo, it's not mentioned in the Gemara. So the Ritva says, no, this is just about Achiv, Eshes, Achiv, Shaloya, Balam. So the Ramban actually says, has a different take. The Ramban says when the Gemara says that Eshes Achiv Shaloya Balomo is not related to him, it didn't mean that he's not related to him, says the Ramban. It means that the fact of the relationship is not the issue. The issue is that they never coexisted, because the brother who he did coexist with is even a closer relative and is even closer to his wife. And nonetheless, that's what Yibum is all about. So what the Gemara meant was the Gemara wasn't trying to say, that these are not, or this isn't an intrinsic relationship. They were saying the relationship part is not the point in Eishes Achiv Shelo Balam. That's Ramban's take. But the Ritva sees it differently. The Ritva says, no, the Gemara only wanted to say that Eishes Achiv Shelo Balamo, that the wife of the brother who you never could have known is less related to you because the brother is less related to you. Ramban has this idea, but the Ritva makes it much further. Ramban says, you're more related to the brother that coexisted with you than you are to the brother who did not. Again, you could have said that the DNA is the same. Just because they exist or coexist might be a factor in Yibum, not necessarily an issue in Kurva. The Ramban also acknowledges that there is a hierarchy and that you're more related to the brother who coexisted with you. But the Ritva goes much further. The Ritva says, with respect to Yibum, he's not your brother. Even though he is your brother, as he says on the Mishnah, he is your brother with respect to Erva, meaning you can't have a relationship with an Eishes Achiv Shelo Haya B'olamo. That would be an illicit relationship. But in terms of Yibum, he's Achicha, She'eno Achicha Gamor at all. Okay, so this little line in the Gemara, which comes very innocuously in just to explain the order of the Mishnah, ends up being, as I say, an interesting window into halachic sociology. Like, how do we look at the hierarchy of different relatives, especially artificial relationships through marriage? Is there a hierarchy? What is that hierarchy? Achiv Shelo Yabalamo, the relationship between Erva, Nachla, Yibum, Edus, etc. Okay, I guess we'll stop here and we'll continue with the next part of the Gemara deals with Tzara. That becomes, really our issue. So we'll pick Amir Tashem up with that next week. Okay? Any questions or? Okay, so I'm assuming everybody is up to date and wish you all a good week and looking forward to continuing.